All right, well, good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Professor Lahouari Addi, who is the 2013-14 Andrew Carnegie Centennial Fellow here at the Center for Contemporary Studies. And I have to note that by his mere presence here, he has literally doubled the number of North Africans that you see us. So that deserves a round of applause. Anyway, Professor Addi holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Grenoble in France and a PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He's currently a researcher at the Centre de Recherche en Anthropologie Sociale et Culturelle, CRASC, which is in Oran, Algeria, and professor at the Institut d'études politiques at the University of Lyon in France. He's the author of numerous books and articles and publishes extensively on North Africa and political Islam. He has most recently published two books. The first is entitled Algeria, Chronicles of a Post-colonial Experience in Modernization. This was published with Barzakh, an Algerian press, in 2012. And two anthropologists in the Maghrib, Ernest, Gellner and Clifford Geertz. This is with Éditions des Archives Contemporaines, Paris, 2013. And I'm happy to report that Lahouari and I are in negotiations with the university press to reproduce some of his writings in English, and hopefully we'll have some positive results soon. Anyway, his talk this evening draws from his most recent work and is appropriately entitled Clifford Geertz and Ernest Gellner on North Africa and Islam, a Comparative Approach. It's been a pleasure to have Professor Addi among us this year, and I thank him for accepting our invitation to share and discuss some of his ideas with us. So, Maghribi, please join me in welcoming him to the center and to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Osama. Thank you for being here. I am very glad to be at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies this year as a research scholar. And this evening I want to share with you a work I implemented about two of the most famous anthropologists of North Africa, Clifford Geertz and Ernest Gellner. Both of them, none of them is French, so they avoid the feeling of guilt that French scholars have towards North Africa. Both of them carried out a fieldwork in Morocco, in a middle-sized city, Sefrou, for Geertz, and in the high Atlas Mountains for Gellner. When he started to work on Morocco, Clifford Geertz was already recognized as an eminent specialist of Indonesia, a country to which he devoted a number of academic articles and books. He wrote a seminal article in 1966, Religion as a Cultural System, that was seen as a breakthrough in sociology of religion. In 1970, he has been solicited to create the social science branch at the prestigious Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. As for Gellner, he wasn't unknown when he started studying Morocco. He was involved in the philosophical and epistemological controversies opposing Wittgenstein to Bertrand Russell. He published in 1958 a book, Words and Things, in which he advocated logical positivism against phenomenology. The book was prefaced by Bertrand Russell. With his ethnographic fieldwork in Morocco, he forged for himself the reputation of an anthropologist of North Africa in the tradition and at the level of Evans Pritchard, of whom he claimed to be the disciple. The two authors, who have Morocco in common, made of North Africa a field where they applied two antagonist approaches of social sciences, going back to Weber's comprehension and Durkheim's explanation. This old debate has had its extension in Oxford and Cambridge in the 30s and the 40s through the controversy around...
This is not a sales call. There has been a rise in crime around your neighborhood, or you have been referred by a friend or neighbor, and you are eligible to receive a free wireless home security system. There is no...
Thank you for letting me pass. So this controversy is the extension of the debate, the old debate between Durkheim and Weber, and the name of this controversy is called the linguistic term debate. Geertz was attracted to the hermeneutic tradition, to Wittgenstein, assuming that society has its source in the intersubjectivity. Gellner disagrees and claims that society is an objective fact to be studied by Cartesian rationalism. This scientist affirmation rests on the idea that culture as ideology prevents man from living in the world as it is. Beyond this theoretical divergence, the two authors dealt with issues at the heart of the evolution of North African societies during the colonial and the post-colonial periods. Let's start with Clifford Geertz. Geertz came to Morocco first in 1965, in the middle of the riots in Casablanca, and the political climate was strained, and the nationalists in Morocco were making pressure on the young king Hassan II to set up modern institutions. 3 years later, he published a book, Islam Observed, comparing religious change in Indonesia and Morocco. He argued that Salafism, more present in Morocco, was only an attempt to restoring the tradition jeopardized by Western modernity. Despite the historical changes that North African societies underwent, Geertz thought that they were responding more to a process of continuity than implementing abrupt change. One must pay attention, he said, to culture as the cognitive frame of the social action. He observed that Islam was in crisis since the 19th century because, he says, the ethos and the worldview didn't correspond anymore to the historical reality. The predominant form of Islam in North Africa was sanctity that used to provide legitimacy to the rulers. Sanctity is based on Sufism, that is a philosophy that opposes life on earth and life in heaven. So, the holy men are powerful on earth because they are the link between the two worlds. The crisis begins with the European expansion, and the question was, how come the powerful holy man couldn't defeat the military invasion of North Africa? the sanctity as symbol was altered, if not broken. A doubt appeared not about the relevance of God's teaching or the Quran, but about the way Islam was practiced. The ulama asked for reforms to go back to Islam of the origins of the Salaf, the pious ancestors. The Salafiyah fueled the nationalist ideas in the 19th century and the 20th century and defeated Sufism, accused to be an obstacle to national consciousness. Geertz says that the Nahda movement didn't reform Islam, but it ideologizes Islam, and here lies the basic difference with Gellner, who thinks that the Salafiyah shares many traits with Protestantism. Gellner states that the ideological underpinnings of the modern Muslim state in North Africa have been provided by Salafiyah, which gave religious legitimacy to the modern nation state. In Gellner's framework, we couldn't understand the emergence of Islamism and the current crisis of Muslim societies. For Geertz, by defeating Sufism and sanctity, the Salafiyah created a void, a vacuum filled up by Islamism. The Islamists, for him, are the byproduct of the Nahda movement that inspired both secularized nationalism and cultural nationalism. Geertz writes that social scientists interested in Arab world did not pay enough attention to the religious change underwent by Muslim societies. In 2005, he wrote an article in which he was saying that observing Islam in the 60s, I was expecting rain. In the following years, 40 years later, we may have gotten flood. I would like to conclude just on the part of Geertz. The sharp critics of positivism by Geertz unleashed a dynamic aiming to refute the anthropological discourse which was becoming less and less accepted by students attracted by the post-colonial studies targeting Western ethnocentrism. He inspired the Santa Fe group, which accused the anthropological discourse of being built on the silence of the natives. However, he didn't take part in the intellectual task of the deconstruction of social sciences and distanced himself from his former students, Paul Rabinoff, Craponzano, Dwyer, and so. And he neither agreed with the post-colonial studies nor with Edward Said. He was opposed to what seemed to him the methodological nihilism of those he called with contempt the meta-ethnologists. Geertz denied his own students because, unlike them, he believed in scientific discourse within social sciences, providing it gives up the natural science approach, stays away from the positivist myth, and gives up mechanical sociology. No matter how opposed Geertz was to Gellner, he seemed closer to him than to the postmodernist he suspected of being hostile to any scientific analysis of human experience. Let's now go to Gellner. I think it's a good bridge here. Gellner arrived in Morocco during the 50s, witnessing the end of the French protectorate and the birth of a monarchy that committed itself to defend Islam as much as modernity. Neighboring Algeria was in war against colonial authorities, and Tunisia was resonating to the independence, to the modernist accent of Habib Bourguiba, who was negotiating the independence of his country. So North Africa was leading the era of ruptures, which was a godsend for an anthropologist, for whom the field was at a boiling point, as in the lab experience of the chemist. Under the eyes of the researcher, the experience was full scale, and all that was necessary was to explain it. It is within this historical context that Gellner forged his model, including the ulema and the saints, the city-dwelling groups and the rural world, the tribe and segmentarity, the Siba and the Maghribi, nationalism and Islam, and so forth. Since the end of the 50s, Gellner had harnessed North Africa in a model that would have some success in the 60s and 70s among the American and European researchers who took an interest in North Africa. The local elites received him favorably because he was confirming that Salafism, or the ulema, or the Nahda movement, was an interpretation of Islam compatible with modernity. But they expressed concerns about the theory of segmentarity, which was supposing that North African societies were stateless societies before colonization, what hurt the nationalist discourse. Gellner was a part of a tradition of British anthropology, the heirs of Durkheim, asserting that the perspective of the analysis of the social bound is that of a group and not that of the individual. And in other hand, he is close to the idea dear to Auguste Comte of social physics, studying a mechanism moved by sociological rules that one must discover. Gellner liked to discover the rationality of these oscillating and steady mechanisms that Ibn Khaldun's town-tribe dialectic and David Hume's ebb and flow of religious faith illustrate with a geometric perfection. Referring to Ibn Khaldun, Gellner constructed an anthropological model of the pre-colonial North Africa from which he attempted to see in what way it changed under colonization and after the independences, taking into consideration the upheavals of that North African societies had undergone since the 19th century. What fascinated him in the Khaldunian paradigm was the movement, pendular or circular, caused by the strength of the tribes with respect to the cities, and at the same time their inability, their incapacity to exist more than 3 or 4 generations. Dynamic, the model rests on an endless movement that periodically destroys the state while, paradoxically, society remains stable. The dissident tribes who take hold of the city motivated by a rigorous religious culture, which permitted Gellner to say that, I quote, "The culture is strong, but the state is weak." In North Africa, the culture is strong, but the state is weak. The model established in this way will lose its automatisms under the colonial period that will profoundly affect it. A new equilibrium appeared in the aftermath of political, social, and economic modifications. The independences of North African countries taking place in the middle of the 20th will not reestablish the old mechanisms because the upheavals will have been irreversible. Colonization will definitively weaken the tribes and put an end to the Khaldunian paradigm overcome by the military superiority of the modern states. The last time, Gellner said, I quote, "The last time the walls came seriously under the walls of the city to threaten it in the old style was in 1912. That time, however, they didn't cause the wheel to rotate in the old manner. The threatened dynasty inside the walls appealed to foreign help and provided the excuse for foreign intervention and the establishment of a colonial protectorate." End quote. The consequence is that the tribes and the saints will lose their importance. The ulema will reinforce their prestige and a new actor will enter the scene, the urban population coming from successive waves of the rural exodus. Puritanism dispelled the cult of the saints because the sociological conditions that had justified them disappeared. Indeed, said Gellner, the administrative centralizations, the means of transport, immigration, and so forth, introduced changes that devalued the function of the saints as mediators in disputes, as guarantors of the borders between tribes, as the moral authority of the weekly markets, as depositories of collective oaths, as poles of gathering and of identification around the tombs serving as sites of pilgrimage, and so forth. For Gellner, the cult of the saints refers to North African sociology marked by the tribal organization from which it arranges the forces and which it structures in view of its reproduction across the social practices, losing their vigor with detribalization. The saints, compared to the noblemen of the ancient regime in France, will lose their functions in the new world of colonization and especially in the one after, in the post-colonial society. On the political map, they were devalued because the religious ideology that they propagated, embedded in the local, is not compatible with the national consciousness born from the colonial shock. The latter is better conveyed by the Muslim reformism that gives itself as a scope of action the community in its ensemble, meaning the nation, into which it breathes a universal patriotism founded on Islam and Arabness, and which the national movement will utilize to realize its political objective of an independent national state. The conclusion of Gellner is that tribal Islam is incompatible with nationalism and with the administration of the central state, in contrast to the Puritan Islam of the ulama, favoring the state-owned form of authority, the factory discipline, and more generally, with the disenchanted world Weber spoke about. Another model sets itself up in which the central state will be a giant with this additional difference that the threat will be situated in the city and not anymore in the countryside. The traditional state, Gellner says, the traditional state did not fear the cities, the colonial state did not fear the countrysides. He concluded, convinced of having provided the explanatory keys of the modern history of the social groups in North Africa. Let me conclude before I take some questions. Gellner and Geertz belonged to the post-colonial period of anthropological learning, and we know how they were different. The one, or Gellner, was gazing at North Africa to explain it. Geertz was observing North Africa to understand it. Gazing is different from observing. The former is global and seeks to scan the group from the perspective of the whole. The latter is local and endeavors to grasp the whole from the bottom. However, whatever the relevance of the one or the other might be, in gazing at North Africa, Gellner didn't see the North Africans, who, for their part, didn't see Geertz observing them. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Professor Addi, for this is a very profound and poetic talk, so I'm looking forward to the questions. But thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. If you don't mind calling on the questions, but I'll only ask you to please identify yourselves before you pose the question. And the floor is open.
My name is Basil Bustati. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service. So my question is, did either Geertz or Gellner recognize the tendency for this universalist Islam that was allying with the nationalists to, I guess, have a more universal vision than just the state, to have a universal vision of a sort of a pan-Islamic polity?
I don't think that it's their preoccupation. Their preoccupation was Islam compatible or not with modernity introduced by the Europeans, by the colonial domination? The answer of Gellner is twofold. He emphasized that Sufist Islam, or Islam of the sense of the tribes, is not compatible with the nation state, with the modernity, because it's local and it's just like Catholicism in medieval Europe. And he makes this comparison. While Islam of the ulama, Islam of the learned, Islam of the city dwellers, it shares many traits with Protestantism of Europe that triggered modernity. So for him, the ulama, who were always there, but they didn't have the military force to impose themselves to the Saints, backed by the tribes, because the city was weak, and the tribe, the countryside, strong. But the ulama took advantage of the colonial order to assert themselves and to be hegemonic in the culture. Geertz didn't agree with this perspective. He said, no, the ulama, the Nada movement, is not so modern as thinks Gellner. The ulama, they wanted to go back to the pristine Islam, which is a myth. And they ideologized Islam. And they were saying, we walked away from the true Islam. Let's go back to the true Islam. So they, for Geertz, the ulama were not as modern as Gellner was thinking. And he said, he adds, the Islamist movement is in the continuation, is the extension of the ulama movement. While Gellner, in an article written in the 1982-83, he said expressly, he can't understand from where Islamism come. I don't know if I answered your question, but my lecture was about just the comparison of the two approaches regarding the religious change in North Africa. Yeah.
Daniel Leap, Assistant Professor in Politics here at the Centre. Thank you for sharing your fresh and I think intriguing perspectives on these two thinkers. I wanted to ask two questions, if I may. The first is about the legacy or the impact of these two individuals on the broader academic discipline. Certainly in the English-speaking world, within the social sciences, although, as you said, for Geertz, anthropology turned away from him in the 80s, he's still widely read. Very much a seminal figure for anthropologists and even for political scientists. If political scientists have read one anthropologist, they've read Geertz. I think perhaps because, as you said, Geertz talks about science and he sees anthropology as science and political scientists like this. It's a language they understand. For Gellner, though, I was really intrigued that you emphasised his role as an anthropologist, because if Gellner's remembered now, he's remembered as a sociologist, and chiefly as a sociologist of nationalism. So, of nationalism. So I think this work on Morocco that he did is perhaps a little bit forgotten. But I was intrigued, I wanted to ask you about the impact of these two figures in the Francophone and Arabophone context in particular, and how they are understood, their work is understood. And the second question, sorry, I don't want to go on too long, but I was really intrigued by this distinction between gazing and observing that you introduced at the end. I wondered if that might be a nice way to try and understand the role of North Africa for European thought, more generally. As is often said, for a slightly different generation of French thinker, for Foucault and Derrida, North Africa is really important in the development of post-structuralist thought, but not as an object in its own right, but as a place from which to stand outside the conventions of French thought. So it's kind of there, but it's absent. No one really talks about North Africa for English, Anglophone thought, but I wondered if you could perhaps elaborate on the gaze, observation, distinction, and how it plays out for these two.
Yeah, I try to play on the words, and this gazing at and observing wanted to connect them to these two currents, two trends in social science, going back to Weber and Durkheim. And I think that, as I tried to say in the conclusion, Geertz is not so far from this. He doesn't like just positivism. He wants build social sciences on something else than positivism. But he believes in scientific work in social science, in studying societies. And it's the reason why he distanced himself from the Santa Fe group, made up in majority by his students. So I try to play on these two words, gazing and observing. The most, what I wanted to say, and I am working on that, and I will try to answer your very interesting question, the legacy. The legacy, first, in North Africa. In North Africa, they are ignored. The students in North Africa who today read, unfortunately, only in Arabic, they don't know Geertz and Gellner. They don't know Geertz and Gellner. So the elites, the bilingual elites in North Africa is Francophone. They knew Gellner and Geertz through the translation into French. And at the beginning in the 70s, Gellner was popular because he was telling the North Africans that Islam is compatible with modernity. And it's the nationalist discourse. And the nationalists liked to hear that. They didn't like him about segmentarity, because segmentarity means that the social group function without the state, without the monopoly of violence. And they didn't like... Now, beside some scholars, some North African scholars in Morocco, in Algeria, and Tunisia, who read Gellner and Geertz, the bulk of the scholars in North Africa, they don't know. They don't know them. So it's now about another aspect of your question. Surprisingly, the only work of anthropology of Gellner is the sense of the Atlas. Sense of the Atlas. All his works relate to the theoretical controversies and epistemology and philosophy and so on. He wrote a lot. He became more famous with his book Nationalism, on nationalism. But if you read with scrutiny this book was inspired by his fieldwork in Morocco. He was saying that the nation is built on the high culture. The high culture is that of the ulama. So how could you write a book on nationalism in societies that are building nation states? How could you forget the experiences where the nations have been built first. England, France, Germany. He built his theory of nationalism on the historical experience of North Africa. And I think it's all the flaws, the theoretical flaws of his book stem from that fact. Yeah.
I think it's actually, this is separate, but just comment, it's not just based on North Africa, but specifically Morocco. Because if you look at Algeria...
It's Morocco, yeah. When I say, yeah. I wanted just to include Algeria.
Yeah, but it's
because I am Algerian.
But you end up with different conclusions if you base it on Algeria. But another way that the legacy is continuing is in this inability to, even to this day, by social scientists to transcend a lot of the binaries in the units of analysis that have been set up by these anthropologists, whether it's Makhzen, Siba, town and country, whether it's Sufi, Alam. These are categories that are still, maybe you disagree, but they're still prevalent in the way social scientists approach the history of North Africa, and specifically Morocco. And then you also reminded me of another aspect of the legacy, which is the complete oblivion of the Rif rebellion of the 1920s. I mean, just when you refer to the last time the country threatened the city was in 1912, we were forgetting what happened 12 years later when the Rif came very close to not only threatening the city, but overtaking the Dua protectorates, in a sense. And I think that's also part of how Moroccan historians have tried to forget or relegate the history of Abd al-Karim. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
He said the last revolt or the last attempt of rotating was 1912. You are right, it was 1958, the Rif.
Yeah.
But remember, this revolt was crushed by military planes.
But I'm also talking about the Rif revolt of 1924, 1926. Abd al-Karim al-Khattabi's revolt. It was more a nationalist resistance to the French and the Spanish than an attempt to overthrow the old dynasty. I don't think that I see, because it longed a long time. They achieved military victories for 10 years. For 10 years. We can talk. I have a different reading of this, but it's beyond this.
I think that it doesn't. It's my point of view. It doesn't. It doesn't come with the model Gellner was talking about. This Khaldunian model, the rotation. The rebellion of Abdelkrim in the 20s until the beginning of the 30s, I think it was a nationalist rebellion, not a traditional one. But the one of 1958, yeah, it belongs to this paradigm. And it has been crushed by military planes. What does it mean? It means that before colonization, the armies of the king and the armies and the tribe, there was a kind of balance of power. But after the colonial order and after independence, there is no balance anymore. Now the central power has a modern army that have tanks, artillery, planes that the tribes can't afford. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. I want to follow up on this question that Daniel asked about observing and gazing, and I'm thinking from a slightly maybe far afield. For Anglo-American letters in the 1950s and 60s, Morocco is actually quite important. It's not a minor place, precisely because as opposed to other places in the Arab world. It's a place where writers go to drop out and to become other and have an experience in ways that are oftentimes ethnographic, but not social science. I wouldn't make that claim, but for countless writers coming from the United States and England, so William S. Burroughs, Brian Geisen, Paul Bowles most famously, and so on. And what's interesting is that all of them are going there precisely because of this issue of the state. Explicitly, William S. Burroughs, his whole fictional project is based on the idea that of an interzone, the international zone where there is no state, right? And I'm just struck by a set of coincidences, and that between these writers who are writing in a different register, but they're going and having extended stays. Robert Irwin goes to Algeria for 2 years as a Sufi, and comes back as an Orientalist, and student of Bernard Lewis, Marina Warner. I mean, this is Esther Freud. These are major writers in the Anglo-American tradition, if that exists, who are going to Morocco and even Algeria to have these experiences, and then building into their writings a representation of a world where state looms large. They're all tone deaf to nationalism, which is interesting. I hadn't thought of this thinking about this as another parallel legacy. Where does Morocco go for Anglo-American thinking? But this seems to me a side tradition. I don't know if that is productive at all. Brian Edwards has written about this quite a bit in terms of letters. Music, it's huge. You can't have rock and roll without Morocco.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Just to say that there is a historical difference between Morocco and Algeria. We should bear in mind that in Morocco, the colonial order lasted only less than 50 years. And there was a kind of course, Morocco wasn't independent, but the monarchy was symbolically there. And the French took the experience from their presence in Algeria to avoid the mistakes they made in Algeria, to avoid the mistake they made. So they tried to preserve some traditional sectors to have them as allies. So it seems to me that in Moroccan culture, there is no sharp rejection of the Westerners as it is in Algeria. There is a kind of intolerance toward Westerners in Algeria. And I am not saying that in Morocco people like them, but they tolerate them. In Algeria they are rejected because Algeria underwent a colonial order that was very tough, and Algerian people identify all European, all Westerners to the French. So it seems to me that it's the explanation why Morocco was more attracting foreign scholars than Algeria. It's not at random that Gellner and Geertz went to Morocco and not to Algeria. And in Algeria, the social structures have been uprooted. Algeria looks like a very, very poor area of France. Not. It's why the Algerian people, they have a hated-love relationship with French. It's because of that. While the Tunisians and the Moroccans, there is more serenity. They are foreigners, and we are Moroccans. But with the Algerian people, it's more, I would say, irrational. But it's history that explains that. Now, just for Bernard Lewis, he never went to North Africa. He went to Turkey. He doesn't know North Africa. Yeah.
I think this, I find this interesting, the parallel between Algeria and Morocco, because when you were talking about Gellner and Geertz, I was thinking about Frantz Fanon's writings on Algeria and how the French, their relation to the Islamic structures of the society. He makes a very convincing, in fact, argument how they tried to break the society, the traditional society, as colonizers by forcing their. I mean, he has this one passage that I remember is when he shows that the owner of a small fabric inviting his employees home tells them, bring your wives with you, and he knows that they will have to bring their wives unveiled. So it was a way of breaking this traditional structure, etc. So I find it very different from what you're describing as Gellner's and Geertz's perspective, thinking how in Morocco Islam could be sort of inserted in this overall dynamic, whereas when you look at the Algerian experience, it's clearly a history of torture. And a torturous history, not a history, I mean history of torture as well, but a torturous history and this love and hate relation because of the colonization dimension. And I find this particularly absent from the analysis that, I mean, in your lecture, I didn't find the historical context so much coming into in the analysis.
Yeah. We should remember that Marshal Dieuté served first in Algeria in the 1890s, and he witnessed the how can I say, the policy, the relationship, the bad relationship, the warlike relationship with the natives. And it was Dieuté who was in charge with the protectorate at the beginning in Morocco. And he didn't want to make the same mistake that his country made in Algeria. In Algeria it was very rough. It was, the historians talk about something like 300 or 400 people. 300,000 or 400,000 people died in a population of 3 or 4 million. It was brutal. At that point in the 50s or 60s, people in France, among the colonial party, they were envisaging of exterminating the natives. So it was very harsh.
Can I interject? Just Lyautey, that wasn't a direct reaction against, it wasn't from Algeria to Morocco, because Lyautey was the disciple of Gallieni in Indochina and Madagascar before he ended up in Morocco. So this new form of colonialism had been pioneered in other places before it reached Morocco, but yes, otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I would argue that it's not a correction, it's simply a continuation of the tradition of the military administration, which goes all the way back to the 1830s and 40s, where the military had a different logic for colonialism than the civilian rules. And Lyautey, Gallieni, they're simply continuing the tradition, which was overturned in 1870 in Algeria. So it's not a correction. This was, at least that's what I've been arguing, is that if you look at how military administrators have approached the colonial problem, as they call it, it always ruled through proxies, through intermediaries, maintain what we call association with the local qa'ids and chiefs, maintain as many of the local institutions as you can, and try to change them incrementally over time. The civilian authorities had a completely different approach to it. That's, if you want to talk about a mistake, that's what changes in 1870. But Lyautey comes out of this tradition and goes to Morocco and simply continues it. But I don't see them really looking at what they did as a mistake. I mean, that would be giving them way too much credit, I think.
Yeah.
You said that 400,000
between 1830 and 1880, the statistics showed that the number of the population were decreasing. And there was a turn up starting from 1890. We have French historians made some work on that. Yeah.
That's nice for me. Does the country-city war, was it the same when the Turks ruled Algeria? Does it continue when the French were colonized, and is it the same now, or does it change?
No, the way the Turks were administrating Algeria was totally different from the French. First, the Ottoman Empire wasn't a nation state. It was a medieval political organization that gives autonomy to local groups. It's not the case of the nation state. And the colonial power tried to build a nation state, the French one, in Algeria, controlling everyone and everything, and every space. While the Turk administration, once a year, they used to go to the countryside with the allied tribes to get the taxes. Once a year. And during the year, the tribe, they had no relationship of the Turkish, the Ottoman administration. And the Turks were in Algiers, Oran, Tlemcen, Constantine, on the suburbs. That's all. It's different.
So the conflict between city-state is different, because the conflict with the country and the city is almost in every society, even in America. Even in the United States, you see the conflict between the country and the city. So it's always, this is not a new phenomenon. So.
Yeah, but not in the Khaldun way. No, unless
Tea Party.
unless you identify the mafia to the rural, and the mafia controlled the cities in the 30s in Chicago. No, I don't think that we can make a comparison with. It was a social organization with its coherence, and it lost its strength with nation state. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Amin. I'm a PhD student in the Islamic Studies department. My question is, do Gellner or Geertz deal at all with the dichotomy of Berber and Arab in dealing with, or is it something that they've put on the table at all?
No, of course. Gellner, especially Gellner, it was one of his most aspect studied in Morocco. His thought is that before colonization, Morocco or North Africa were Berber. And the Arab culture was strong in cities. And the Arab culture was the culture of the elite, and it was a minority. And whenever the tribes took over, it was Berber tribes. But even though they were Berber, when they take over, they claim to be Arab, and they claim to be political. So there's a kind of antagonism of Arabness and Berberness in Gellner. And what is funny in Gellner, he says that the France Arabized North Africa. France made North Africa more Arab because the ulama, they claim to defend, or that they are Berbers, but they are more attached to Arabic culture, to Arabic language. The ulama, they don't use while the saints are Berber, and the saints, they use the Berber language to explain the Quran in Berber language. And this model that lasted many, many centuries, the colonial domination broke it. And the Berbers, and Gellner didn't understand why the Berbers fueled the nationalist movement. He asked the question, why the Berbers, they are supporting the nationalists? The French, they are liberating them from the Arab domination. This question is expressed as I am quoting it. So for him, the colonial order put an end to tribes, to Berberness, to sanctity, and it unleashed the nationalist movement that claim to be Arab and Muslim in the way of the Maghrib. While Geertz didn't give much attention to that. The majority of North African people are Berber, and they are attached to Islam. And for him, there was changes in symbols, and there is a crisis because the symbols are not anymore as relevant as they were. If you read in French, you do. So in my book, I don't know if there is a copy in the library, there is a chapter on Gellner et la Berbérité. Yeah, you had a question, I guess.
Well, is there basically between Geertz and Gellner, especially in Anglophone social science studies, is there a third way that's developing? How do you see this? Because I'm trying to follow up on Professor Neep's question about legacy, but have social scientists taken stock of these two approaches and are developing, as I mentioned earlier also, there's a lot been written about transcending the binaries. Arab, Berber is one of them, but there's also Bahs and Siba and Desert Zone. How do you see the field, how's the field evolving as far as sociological approaches to Morocco?
I think that we can talk about post-Geertzian approach and not post-Gellner approach. The Gellner approach is too mechanical. It's too mechanical. And the anthropologists, for it's my point of view, they read more or they use more Geertz than Gellner. Even though they think that the works of both of them now is getting old and dépassé. Dépassé. Now we have new approaches, and it's normal to be undertaken. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Megan Navarro. I'm university staff, and my question actually relates to what you were just saying about the relevance of symbols. And I know that one of Geertz's primary theories is actually the theory of semiotics, and that culture is a system of symbols for one to interpret. And so I wondered if you saw this in his interpretation of Islam in Morocco and its interplay with modernity in the state. And if you did, how it contrasted with Gellner's focus on rational mechanics, or if it did.
Yeah, it's different approaches. I mean, the approaches are deeply different. The Gellner stresses that society is given. It's a fact. And we study it, and it functions with rules. And there is a kind of logic. While Geertz says no, society stems from the interaction of intersubjectivities. It's not a fact. If we want to understand society, we need to understand the meaning of the symbols from the native's point of view. And we can't talk about rationality or irrationality. If we accept the values in which they believe, we will see a kind of rationality. And the crisis for Geertz comes when the symbols lose their relevance. It's the case, he says, it's the case of Islam. How come in the Quran it said that God loves the Muslims? How come he made the Christians more powerful? It's symbolism. It's symbol. Why this? Why the powerful holy man can't defeat the French armies? There is something wrong. The symbols were broken. So Geertz says people didn't come to the conclusion that the word of God is false. No, they went on believing in the Quran, but they said the way we believe is not good. We walked away through Islam. Let's go back to renew the symbols, to revigorate the symbols. And it's the Salafiyya movement. Yeah?
Why do you think they chose to continue on the path instead of rejecting?
How come rejecting? Rejecting the Quran?
Yeah, if that was an option. Or was it never an option?
Yeah, with modernity, Europe didn't reject the religion. There was the schemes, Protestantism. What perhaps Geertz didn't elaborate on that, but the path would have been a modern interpretation of Islam. But Is it possible with the state of the culture, of philosophy in the Arab world? It's not possible. We should bear in mind that Protestantism appeared at a period of time where Europe was developing a philosophy, walking away from the Greek philosophy, the ancient philosophy. And the Muslim world wasn't, and still now, they are not developing a secular vision of religion. By secular vision of religion, I would say an individualist conception of religion. And I think that modernity didn't get rid of religion. Modernity developed an individualist conception of religion. Religion is not the business of the group, it's the business of the individual. It's the basic change. And this change, the Muslim world is trying to... the Muslim world can't implement it, but he has to. He has to. Yeah?
Throughout your talk, you have created this picture of Geertz and Gellner being opposites almost, as if their frameworks are incommensurable. But I think perhaps they have more in common than you give them space to. Both Gellner and Geertz seem to see society as a form of totality. You know, Gellner, as you said, tries to explain various social phenomena with regards to particular factors in a very rational way and how they come together to create, say, nationalism or whatever it is. But Geertz also has this idea of culture and symbols as forming a unity. You know, you can actually gain access to this unity. Every symbol has a meaning in relation to other symbols within that universe. And this whole problem that arises, as you say, when his whole effort seems to be to explain what happens when that symbolic universe begins to collapse and how it's brought back together again. So I think they both have, you know, in certain respects,
I think
a great deal in common.
I think, yeah. It's why they exchange. They exchange aggressively, but they exchange. While with the Santa Fe group, there was nothing in common. There was nothing in common. But with Gellner and Geertz, it's, you know, the divide between Durkheim and Weber is not absolute. It's not absolute. They have the same object. They try to explain or to study, or I don't know which word I need to use, social action. Durkheim starts from the whole social structure. Weber starts from at a micro level. And why they are related? Because in sociology you have two elements that are inseparable. You have in one hand society and in the other hand the individual. And we will have always these two trends in sociology. Bourdieu tried to overcome this divide by the sociology of the habitus. He tried to reconcile Durkheim and Weber, but he failed. One of my books was on Bourdieu, and I tried to show why he failed. He failed because there is no a third element. There is society and the individual. Either you analyze society starting from the individual or from the group. But this problematic is how can I say? These two elements belong to the same problematic. And it's why you are right. Gellner and Geertz belong to the same problematic. Gellner stresses on the structures. And there is a dynamic of structures. He doesn't care of people. It's why I said, gazing at North Africa, he didn't see North Africans. There is no people in Gellner's thought. There is only Islam with I, capital I, nation, state, tribe. You have only these disembodied categories. While in the Geertz approach, you have people. But these people, they can't understand what Geertz is saying about them. Because Geertz belongs to a culture that is marked by the philosophy of Kant, Immanuel Kant, and the North African, their culture is still marked by the philosophy of Plato, the Sufism. The Sufi, they are Platonic. To the real world and the false world is Plato. So they belong to Plato, the North African belong to Plato today, and the Greeks belong to the Kantian culture. They can't understand what he's saying. Qu'est-ce qu'il dit? Yeah?
Thank you. James, I'm a Georgetown. My question to follow up the gentleman's question about the Islam role in modernization of the Muslim world. As we observe that this gentleman also mentioned that Anglo thinking that you see in the Christian history there are several I would say modernization or break away from the old thinking, like Martin Luther, and then England break away from Venegan, and then American also. There's a lot of, even today, and the other day I was attending a lecture by a woman professor from Georgia Medical School, and he said religion has no role in some family, perhaps 50% of the family, when they have an interface marriage. That means if you look at Christian history, they have modernization moment, one after another. Are there any such kind of moments happening in Islamic history which even today, and also it was here, and a few weeks ago it was Kuwait parliament member, former parliament member, the lady, and she's a visiting professor here, and she talked about tribal society in Kuwait. And even today, there, as you mentioned, that tribal still, it's a very, very important phenomenon in almost all over our Muslim world. So I mean, do you see a role of Islam as a factor that prevents the Muslim world becoming modern society?
So it's not Islam that prevents, because religion per se doesn't exist. What exists is the interpretation that social groups they have. Now, is it possible to have a modern interpretation of religion based on the Quran? Yes. Yes. But this modern interpretation doesn't exist now. Why? It's my perception. It's my assumption. I think that because of the absence of modern philosophy in the Muslim world, the theology didn't renew itself. The theology didn't renew itself, and the Muslim world is still at the edge, in theology, at the edge of an Ash'ari. As if we say, the theology in Christendom is still at Saint Augustine, or more modern, Saint Thomas d'Aquin, Aquino. Now there was since the Protestantism and mostly the 19th century, new currents in theology, but it's because of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And there is no, I tried to implement a survey on philosophy in the Arab world, in the schools and in the universities, they are still teaching the Islamic philosophy and the Western philosophy as it was parallel. They didn't see that the so-called Islamic philosophy belongs to the Western tradition of philosophy. Through Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and so on. It's not Ibn Rushd, it's Aristotle. Ibn Sina, it's Plato. It's not, we have our philosophy, they have their philosophy. No. So, they are still at the university training the students in this way. So, in the absence of the modern philosophy, I don't see how the theology could develop to supersede the discourse or the ideology of an Ash'ari and Ibn Hanbal and all of that. Yeah?
Next question. My name is Ernest. I am a physician and originally from Algeria. You said that for a religion,
For
a religion to enter modernity, it needs to switch from the group approach to the individual approach. When we look at the so-called Arab Spring and its approach and its the outcome of this movement, where do you think the problem was or is?
what do you call spring?
The famous Arab Spring that happened all over the Arab world, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt. The spring word means that there is an attempt to go toward modernity, maybe to go from group to individual approach. It failed. It failed dramatically. Where do you think the problem is?
So these revolts, I don't call them spring or winter or summer.
All seasons.
No. These revolts against the regime express the deep predicament of the Arab world, of Arab societies. It could trigger the beginning of the construction of modernity, of modern institutions. It could, but the way it's unfolding in Libya and Syria, we have a right to be pessimistic, you know. No, the problem is, I think that the main problem of the Arab societies are at the level of the culture. And the radical Arab nationalism that promised modernity and by Arab radical nationalism I mean Nasser, Boumediene, they failed. They failed. A huge failure. Now, the future, modernity in the Arab world belongs to the future. It's underway. Perhaps we don't see some trends. It's underway because it's contradictory. Societies are, in Algeria, I see it, it's underway, but it needs to be enhanced by political movements. By political movements. Even the Islamist movement, it's a contradictory product of the modernity. The Islamist movement, they don't want to go back to the Middle Age. But they bear a deep contradiction at the heart of their ideology. They believe that they can build modernity with the Quran, with al-Ash'ari. But what gives some heart? They want modernity. I remember in Algeria in 1991, there was a debate between the leader of Islamists and the leader of the Democratic Party or laïc or a religious party. And the leader of the Islamist party said in this debate at the television and with his hands, batting his hand the table, with the will of Allah, we will transform this country into a new California. Not a new Saudi Arabia, a new California. So there is a willingness to develop, to modernize, but it's surrounded by cultural problems.
All right, I think we are out of
Okay,
time.
thank you very much.